The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion has no shortage of unique weapons. Some can be obtained quite early on in your playthrough, while others may be locked behind a high level requirement. Some of the ones that I've really enjoyed messing around with are Goldbrand, the enchanted flame katana, Mehrunes Razor, the dagger with a chance to insta-kill, and Wabbajack, the staff that produces an unpredictable effect. Speaking of staves, there are a few in the game that have some bizarre and thrilling effects. Of course, there's the aforementioned Wabbajack, but there's also Sanguine Rose, the flower-like rod that conjures a random Daedra to fight by your side. And there's also the Skull of Corruption, a cheeky weapon that creates a clone of the targeted NPC. Then of course you have the staves that are simplistic with their effects, but still have a rather unique look to them. Think the Staff of Worms, Hromir's Ice Staff, and the Staff of Indaris. Sitting in that category as well is the Goblin Shaman Staff, the center point for today's video. You see, a while ago, I asked for recommendations on challenge runs. One of them that I really liked was playing through the main questline using only the tutorial Goblin Staff. For the longest time, that was my intention. However, I recently decided to alter the idea. I wanted to stray away from the challenge aspect and give more of a review and deep dive on the weapon. Instead of embarking on a whole questline with it, I decided to run a gauntlet of many different unrelated side quests. This way, I could see how it matches up against specific enemies with varying numbers in specific spaces and at certain levels. First though, let's get acquainted with the weapon. What is the tutorial staff and how do you get it? Most people probably know of it, but for those who don't, the Goblin Shaman Staff is actually the very first unique weapon the player comes across. It's featured in the game's tutorial just before you reach the Imperial Subterrane. You'll wander into a goblin den and face off against 4 of the creatures. One of them is a Goblin Witch. In the Witch's inventory will be the aforementioned weapon, your introduction to the world of staves. Its appearance is rather interesting. It has a goblin's head attached to the end of it, and the rod portion is made up of bones. Hence the unique aspect of the weapon. But other than that, its effect is rather simple. It inflicts 5 points of shock damage on the target. That's it. It actually deals less damage than the shock spell, which is novice level destruction and can be cast by pretty much anyone's character at any time. What's more, the Goblin Shaman Staff only has a total charge of 150 with a cost of 9 per cast. That means you can only use it 16 times before it needs to be recharged. Or in other words, you can only deal 80 points of damage with it. To put that into perspective, and is actually something we'll witness soon, a basic low-level zombie has 80 health points. So, you'll only be able to defeat the undead if every single cast hits its mark. But wait, it gets worse. Due to the fact that you can only find it early on, it doesn't have the ability to level with the player. Again, you'll get to witness it soon, but while all of your enemies increase their stats, you'll still be blasting away with a staff that's inferior to the most basic of shock spells. With that light-hearted explanation out of the way, it's time to get introduced to the man behind the weapon. I present to you Gandalf. No rhyme or reason behind this name, of course, just a cool title that came to me in my sleep. Now, a major pro, but also a major con for wielding staves, is that they aren't governed by any of the attributes or skills. So, while designing Gandalf, I didn't really put much thought into his build. I just guessed at some of the various tactics and gameplay mechanics that I'd be relying on the most, and put everything into those. The spread was pretty incoherent, and there wasn't a whole lot of synergy, but it did the trick for now. Gandalf ends up getting reworked in a bit though, so I won't be spending too much time on explaining my choices right now. Circling back a bit, I wanted to briefly discuss why staves not being governed by skills is a touchy subject. On one hand, it's a good thing because any character can use them regardless of level or build. They're essentially reusable scrolls. There, however, is a pretty significant con to them. Since they aren't influenced by skills, using them doesn't contribute at all towards leveling. So, if you're completely reliant on staves for your attacks, there's a very good chance that you'll outlevel yourself. While those passive skills like light armor, athletics, acrobatics, mercantile, etc. level up, creating new avenues for different abilities, your combat power will remain the same. A weapon that has identical stats as it did 5 levels ago. With an explanation of the weapon and a brief description of my character out of the way, it's finally time to get into playstyle. Going into this playthrough, I knew right away that my biggest hurdle was going to be recharging the staff. My thinking was that 16 casts were going to fly by, and that I need a steep supply of filled soul gems. So the original plan was to buy and steal as many filled soul gems as possible and to abuse the Mages Guild recharging services. To fund this, I'd be using the reward money from side quests as well as the revenue from plundered loot. Because of that, I picked the Thief as my star sign, specialized in stealth abilities, chose personality and agility as my favorite attributes, and then picked speechcraft, security, restoration, mercantile, athletics, acrobatics, and block as my major skills. Like I said before, there was no synergy here at all. Very quickly into the playthrough, I realized that my method for obtaining soul gems was not sustainable. The demand for recharging the Goblin Shaman staff was going to be too much. I'd eventually run out of soul gems to steal, and the recharging services are actually quite expensive. So this is where I reworked Gandalf and allowed myself some conveniences. My new method for obtaining filled soul gems, and is probably the most obvious thing to think of, would be through using Soul Trap. I'd have to make sure though that I carry around a lot of empty gems. With that being said, new Gandalf, or Gandalf the White, again the name just sort of came to me in a dream, works a little differently. His star sign is the Mage, he specializes in magic, his favorite attributes are intelligence and willpower, and his major skills are sneak, security, mysticism, mercantile, restoration, acrobatics, and athletics. A little more coherence here, but still a bit wacky. Mysticism was to ensure that I could use Soul Trap, and restoration is for the second convenience. Attacks are solely reliant on the staff, but I decided to be laid back and allow heals with spells. With that being said, it's finally time to embark on this adventure. The first bit of housekeeping I did was actually purchase the soul gems. To my surprise, Rindir's staffs didn't have any available. I thought for sure he would, given that his whole gimmick relies on them to power his inventory, but I suppose not. Fortunately, Calendil over at the Mystic Emporium had 15 petty soul gems available. What's more, they were pretty cheap, costing around 19 gold apiece, and they get restocked pretty frequently, so Calendil was my plug for pretty much this whole experiment. The next order of business was buying a Soul Trap spell. Alberic Lidda of the Coral Mages Guild Hall had a version available for 265 gold. Short a bit of change, I decided to delve into my first dungeon crawl. Well, sort of. The first two zones of Vilverin are fairly beginner friendly, a couple of bandits and a lot of loot. As of this moment though, I had no way of recharging the staff, so once it was out of juice, that was it for offense. During this expedition, I learned that at level 1, bandits take around 4 to 5 casts to defeat, which is more than I expected. In the tutorial area, the staff felt really overpowered, enemies were dropping like flies. However, in the real world, quote unquote, I got a Cyrodiilic reality check. On enemy number 4, the weapon was officially out of commission. So from there, I booked it around the rest of the zone, collected enough items, and ran right back out. It wasn't a very fun experience, and I crossed my fingers that I wouldn't have to go through that again, or else it was just going to be boring. However, something positive that I did take away from this was that this specific dungeon run was indeed possible. I easily could have taken out the remaining bandits if my staff had the charge, so that was at least a win in my mind. Another point to consider was that even though the range on this thing is pretty decent, missing a shot is almost as bad, if not worse, than getting hit. The staff doesn't have a lot of charge and the casts go quickly, so I think it's better to sacrifice safety for accuracy. Finally, with Soul Trap purchased and available for use, it was time to run through some side quests. Being in Coral, the first one on my list was the Killing Fields. Fighting off waves of goblins in an open area with 2 companions by my side. Arguably one of the better ways to practice using the staff. I knew for a fact that I probably wasn't going to receive Chill Rend, but if I could fill a couple of soul gems, that would be a win in my books. The goblins came in 3 waves. At first, I made it a point to meet them head on, cast Soul Trap on one of the creatures, and focus my efforts on that specific one for the capture. If I was smart, I would have cast the spell on all of them, as the brothers did a pretty good job at killing the stragglers. The goblins took about 4 or so casts to defeat. On the final wave, I had a little bit of trouble landing my hits. I had to make sure that I wasn't attacking either of the Odo boys, and the creatures were pretty sporadic with their movements. Similar to most of the other ranged attacks in this game, the crowd control was non-existent. It took some time to aim each spell and for the casting animation to go through. If I was successful, the process needed to be repeated at least 3 more times per enemy. Meanwhile, the Odil brothers started to die off and the goblins were focusing me. One of the last NPCs I faced off against was a goblin skirmisher. This was where I encountered realization number 2. Not every enemy will fit in the petty soul gem. I already knew that was something I was going to have to deal with, but the whole idea for this venture is that the quests fuel themselves with the souls. If I came across a mission where every enemy was too high level for the petty soul gems, that would practically be game over. With the goblins defeated, I returned to Valis and informed him that the farm was saved. I also threw in the minor detail that both of his sons died and his family line was over, but that's neither here nor there. Of course, no reward, so no money for new soul gems, but for now, I could live with selling off the loot from the attack. The next quest I embarked on was the Ghost Ship of Anvil, and I was rather excited for it too. A lot of times in the past that I've done this quest, for one reason or another, I haven't actually been able to hit the ghosts, so to literally have a weapon designed for such a thing was like a breath of fresh air, or so I thought. I forgot that no matter what level you are, the dead sailors come back in the form of wraiths. This meant that 5 points of shock damage wasn't really going to go a long way, and their souls weren't going to fit in a petty soul gem. Essentially the entire fear that I just outlined. I was basically just burning charges with this quest. The loot I was getting off of the remains, as well as around the ship, was pretty decent, so at least I could afford more empty soul gems afterwards. Since all that's needed to fuel the goblin staff are petty gems, it feels overkill and a waste of money to buy anything larger. I know though that doing so would have gone a long way in moments like these, but I still couldn't quite justify it. In fact, at one point, the pressure had gotten so bad that I took the fight outside and had the townsfolk help out. My defense wasn't holding up and I was dangerously low on recharges. After the battle was over, I quickly swam over to a nearby shoreline and did some soul farming. One plus about the petty gems is that the most minute of enemies can fill them up, in this case mud crabs. What's more, mud crabs, rats, slaughterfish, etc., they'll always be available for me to hunt, no matter how high of a level I get to. So while goblins turn into war chiefs and shamans, and imps to minotaurs and trolls, the nuisance creatures remain the same. Returning to the Serpent's Wake and closing out the quest, I thought for sure Red Wave was going to provide a pretty penny. It didn't though, and in fact it only sold for about 100 gold. I was once again hit with that level 1 Oblivion reality check. The next quest I embarked on was a bit of a doozy. I was really curious to see how the staff was going to line up against the undead, more so zombies and skeletons. So I quickly enlisted with the Mages Guild and took on the Skingrad recommendation, rescuing Airthor from Bleakflat's cave. I actually thought this one was going to be incredibly easy. Zombies, skeletons, a staff, introductory quest to the guild. I couldn't have been more wrong. I've always had an issue with zombies in Oblivion. Without some sort of fire attack, I feel like they're way more difficult than they need to be. They have way too much health and hit way too hard. Their attacks are slow, so they're not too hard to dodge, but most of their encounters are in tight spaces and linear caves, so getting out of the way can be quite difficult. I have no shame in saying that after a few attempts, I abandoned this quest. It turns out my calculations before were wrong. I said that one full charge with the staff was enough to kill a zombie. Well, I forgot to take into account their 30% resistance to magic. So if anything, my casts were only doing 3.5 points of damage per hit. This was absolutely not sustainable for my playstyle. When you do runs like this, you kind of turn into a numbers freak. Every enemy has a value attached to them. With each new fight, I think about how much charge was needed to kill said NPC. If they fill a soul gem before I sapped up all 16 casts, then it'd be worth it. If it was an even trade, that wouldn't fly, but I'd have to take it. If the trade-off was negative, I'd move on. A minor consideration too was the loot the enemy had on them and what it could be sold for. Zombies were the worst of all worlds, so that's why I left Airthor to rot in the cave. Switching tracks here, this next quest was actually quite nice. I knew that I wanted to do this one, I just wasn't sure what level I wanted to be at. As it would turn out, closing the Kvatch Oblivion Gate at level 1 feels like something Bethesda intended. The pacing and fights were really smooth. There was a decent amount of difficulty, I couldn't just steamroll through everything. Yet each Daedra only took a couple of hits to defeat, so I wasn't wasting my time here either. What's more, the scamps were plentiful and they were able to fill my soul gems no problem. So it felt like I was net positive coming out of here. Running through the Deadlands, I had help from Vonius pretty much all the way up until the tower. He would tank, I would DPS, life was easy. Similar to the killing fields, I had to be really careful while my companion was duking it out with an enemy. It was incredibly easy to fire a stray lightning bolt, and that would have been it for Elend. Once inside the Blood Feast, Vonius was a goner. First fight, he went down, and I was left to complete the crawl on my own. I don't think I've ever had Elend make it through the gate alive, let alone make it this far into the realm. From here on out, the difficulty increased a smidge. The 2-on-1s were pretty tricky, and Dramoral Churls were introduced into the mix. They had a net negative outcome. Their souls were beyond petty, so facing them set me back in terms of charging the staff. The loot in here though was outstanding, more than enough to buy out Calendil back at the shop. I suppose the only real negative to being in here was the hurdle to buying more soul gems. Back in Cyrodiil, it's pretty easy to escape danger, fast travel for supplies, and jump back in. It's not so difficult here, as you can just book it out of the gate, but there is at least an extra layer that you need to get through first. In any case, making it to the final room and pulling out the sigil stone, I put a pin in breaking the Siege of Kvatch. Overall, a very positive experience and a long needed W. The next quest was actually really simple, and again, it left a good impression on me. Bear Season over at Shardrock Farm is as straightforward as it gets. Kill 6 bears that are terrorizing Thorley Ethelred's home. The bears are leveled with me, and because I'm only level 1, they were incredibly easy opponents. They were black bear cubs and went down with 5 or so casts. There was ample enough space to run around, back up, and dodge their attacks. What's more, they filled petty soul gems, so it was a net positive outcome. The only real difficulty was actually finding the beasts in the thick fields, but that was more so a me problem than a staff problem. I wouldn't say I walked away from this one with any valuable lessons or information though. Maybe just a little more hope and faith in the Goblin Shaman staff. The final level 1 quest that I embarked on was the Grave Finder's Repose. I wanted to see how the staff would match up against necromancers. Of course, I was slightly worried that a necromancer dungeon meant undead, which meant more zombies. If that was the case, then this quest would have been a wash. Luckily, Moss Rock Cavern mostly consisted of nuisance creatures and dark wizards. Said necromancers would summon zombies to aid them, but so long as I killed the mages quick enough, it wasn't really an issue. As you probably could have guessed, there were a lot of negative encounters in here. I didn't have any black soul gems for the humanoids, so those were a bust. However, the nuisance creatures in between provided some much needed relief. Plus, I was pretty rich after the Oblivion Gate, so I wasn't too worried about running low on stock. Soon enough, there was also a group of skeletons that made up for all of the used charges. Only after facing Raylan the Gravefinder did I discover a pretty sweet farming method. If the necromancer summoned a simple ghost to fight by their side, I could use Soul Trap, blast it down in 4 casts with the staff, and repeat the process. This was a pretty useful technique, but of course, pretty limited on when I'd actually get to use it. I suppose the old summon a skeleton yourself and farm it for the souls trick could have worked here as well. With around 6 or so quests attempted, my opinion on the Goblin Shaman staff was pretty much formed. However, there was one final experiment that I wanted to try. Level 1 runs are easy. Being level 1 is the easiest time you'll ever have in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. Enemies are scaled to your low stats, so just about any attack with a smidgen of thought put into it will do the trick. What I wanted to see though was how the Goblin Shaman staff would fare against a level 10 environment. A world where the NPCs have gotten stronger and more challenging, yet by nothing too crazy. I artificially inflated my character's level, forgoing any attribute multipliers, and set off back into Cyrodiil. I'll be brief for this portion because, let's just say, things went exactly how I thought they would. The first thing I tried were some matches in the arena. The pit dog fights are supposed to be the least challenging, so when the yellow team combatant came out and gave me the beating of a lifetime, I knew I was in over my head. With no black soul gems, there was no way to capture any souls. I was burning through my petty supply, as not only did their health take a long time to go down, I was practically missing every other shot. The fast-paced combat, me-or-them mentality kicked in, and I just sort of spammed my attacks. I came out on top for the first match, but the next one would be a whole other ordeal. The combatant came out swinging with a dwarven longsword, and before long, sent me straight to the Shadow Realm. Only after cheesing the fight did I stand a sliver of a chance, and even then, it was incredibly close until the end. The next quest I tried was a brush with death. I wanted to face off against some trolls and have a grand old time doing it. So what better way to experience it than in the painted world? Well, as it would turn out, it was a horrendous time. I got Wraith to join the fight, but he would get Hulk smashed into the ground, and then the attention was set on me. For a while, I did a decent job at evading its attacks. The issue though was that these things had way too much health for the Goblin staff to handle. Any lulls in the fight, and the work I'd put in was negated by their healing abilities. I was burning through soul gems and still far away from my goal. Plus, this was the first of 6 trolls. There was no hope for fire attacks, and no way to apply turpentine to the staff. So, cutting my losses yet again, I abandoned the painted world. This next quest was a nice turn of events though. After reuniting the Germain brothers, the next affair was to clear Weatherly of its ogre residence. I genuinely wasn't sure how this one was going to go. Ogres are some of the most powerful creatures I've faced in the game. They hit really hard and have lots of health. With my current setup, I was really nervous. Luckily, the Redguard Valley ogres have weaker stats than their kin to the north. They only have 120 health points versus a regular ogre at my level, which would have had around 260. It was still a net negative experience, but only needing to face 3 of them and having all of Cyrodiil to kite them through was good enough for me. At this point, almost every single NPC I face is going to be larger than a petty soul. You have to either pivot to larger gems, make frequent trips to shorelines, or farm summons. Gone are the days of self-funding quests. This mission was a success, but I wouldn't say it went well. It took way too long to complete, and I had to play it safe the whole time, kind of wiping the fun from the experience. Before wrapping up, there were 2 more expeditions that I wanted to go on. The first was a run through Memorial Cave. I wanted to see how the staff would fare against vampires. It actually wasn't the worst. I think I could have killed each vamp with 1 full charge. They weren't hitting too hard, and it was relatively easy to back up through the dungeon. The problem though came from their undead companions. I had to get through a zombie before I could finish off the first vampire. Like I said before, without fire, zombies are way too hard, and with this crummy staff, next to impossible to kill. However, I wholeheartedly believe that I could have taken out the basic vampires if they didn't have the extra protection. So maybe next time a run through Bloodcrust Cavern would have been better. A straight circuit, no fluff, and isolated opponents. In the end though, this attempt was a wash. Finally, the last thing I tried was returning to Kvatch and liberating the city from its Daedric invaders. Running through the gates, town guard by my side, I was faced with Flame Atronachs. Definitely better than Storm Atronachs, as those would have been impossible to hit with the staff. Even so, the flames far outmatched the resistance's skill level, and it was an outright bloodbath. Savlian Mattius put up the fight of a lifetime, his fellow watchman died a fiery death, and I was throwing around mere pinches of damage. It was obvious that this wasn't going to happen. I was almost out of soul gems, and each round of casts would maybe get me through a third of their health. In the end, I cut my losses, left Kvatch, and ended the experiment. So overall, here are my thoughts on the tutorial Goblin staff. I knew coming into it that this thing was going to quickly become obsolete. However, little did I know that that would be right after leaving the sewers. I thought for sure it would be able to hold down almost all level 1 fights, but I was sorely mistaken. Of course, the glaring issue seems to be with its 5 points of shock damage. Like mentioned before, that's half of the damage produced from the most basic of shock spells. Obviously, it's a really crummy stat, and that should have been the tip-off from the get-go. However, I personally think that the staff's charge is the biggest issue. 16 casts are barely anything. Some of the best staves in the game have equal or better charge amounts, and those can make significant waves against your enemies. It's probably very obvious, but I don't think this staff was meant to be used beyond the first 3 quests of the game. Staves in general are great supplemental weapons, but I don't think they should be the only thing you rely on in battle. They offer nothing for your skills and will 100% hold you back from properly leveling. Unless you hoard staves that have leveled abilities, I don't recommend making them your main source for anything. At level 10, I knew exactly how the playthrough was going to go. This staff was pretty much rendered useless, and recharging it was more trouble than it was worth. One of the few pros is that it only needs petty soul gems to refuel it, so at least it was a cost-efficient process. In the end, I'm glad I didn't go through the main questline with it, because otherwise I'd be pulling my hair out. It was an interesting challenge though, as I've honestly never really used staves in Oblivion before. Sure, maybe here and there I'd pull one out if I was in a bind, but they've never really made their way into my weapons rotation, so I'll give it that. I'm just shocked at the staff's poor performance, even at level 1. They could have at least given it 10 points of shock damage to put it on par with the worst shock spell. I'm unsure what the thought process was behind its design, but it's not very good. I know though I'm being really harsh on a weapon that's supposed to stink, so I'll end it there. I wouldn't call this a challenge playthrough as much as I would a dive into the weapon profile itself. I actually had a lot of fun doing it though, and it's something I'd consider doing again, just with another weapon or piece of armor. If you have any suggestions, leave them down below. The Truncheon of Submission would be a wild experience, so maybe that could be something to look into. Until next time, keep on adventuring. In the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion, there are plenty of ways to start out a playthrough. Some people might leave the sewers and shoot for certain factions. Others head towards Coral to begin the main questline. A select few delve into the nearby dungeons in search of treasure, and a handful might try their hand at acquiring specific gear. The thing is though, at level 1, almost all of the normal weapons and armor have similar stats. At most, you might see a 2 to 3 point difference. Enchanted and leveled gear can put you ahead of the norm by a bit, but maintaining the charge and overall condition can prove to be expensive. That begs the question, are there any weapon or armor pieces that are 100% worth retrieving at level 1? Ones that can make a difference well into your playthrough when you've hit level 10 and beyond? Well, as it would just so happen, there very well could be. There's a set of gear out there that's practically become synonymous with overpowering your character. That gear set is Umbra's ebony armor and sword. For today's video, I wanted to acquire the sword and armor at level 1 and test out their capabilities. Confession time, I've never done this build before. I've never used her set at level 1, so it'll be interesting to see just how powerful it is compared to the normal armor and weapon sets, if at all. Part of the challenge is actually retrieving the items, while the other part is seeing how well they fare in Cyrodiil. I'll be discussing the best ways of acquiring the gear, how easy it is to repair and maintain the items, how well they do their job, and at the end, I'll continue to test them out with a character who's level 10 plus. First and foremost, let's discuss Umbra's armor and sword. For those who don't know, this early game quote-unquote exploit has been around for quite some time. You basically get access to incredibly powerful gear right after leaving the sewers. By traveling south of the Imperial City waterfront and heading towards Old Bridge, you'll see an alien ruin pop up on your compass. This is Vindicel. Depending on your level, you'll come across some form of Daedric or Conjurer resistance around the exterior. However, the interior is far tamer. Apart from a few nuisance creatures, really the only thing the player needs to worry about is a handful of traps. Vindicel is a rather small dungeon, and at the end of the line, we come across our person of interest. Standing by a makeshift camp is the wood elf named Umbra. Umbra is wearing a full set of ebony gear, and she fights using a unique leveled enchanted sword called Umbra. She's currently non-hostile and doesn't offer much in the way of dialogue. The reason for this, which also plays a massive part in the whole exploit, is because she's the center point for Clavicus Vile's Daedric Shrine quest. The long short of it is that the Daedric Prince wants you to defeat her in combat, and then he wants you to bring her longsword back to his shrine. From there, the blade either gets exchanged for his true Daedric artifact, or the player chooses to keep Umbra for themselves, which ends up offending Clavicus Vile. However, as mentioned prior, the blade can be exploited. Before the quest is even activated, and up until you hand it over to Vile, it's considered a quest item. That means it has a weight of 0. While inventory space alone isn't enough to convince most people, Umbra's sword is leagues ahead of every other weapon you can acquire early on. It can put out 3 times more damage than an iron claymore, swings much faster, and has almost as good a reach. If your character favors blades, you can cut down your enemies in less than half the time it would take you with normal melee weapons. It's an exceptional blade that will make you overpowered from the get-go. The biggest hurdle, however, is actually acquiring the sword. To pry it off of Umbra's corpse means defeating her in combat. Defeating her in combat at level 1 is practically impossible. Umbra is level 50. She has 394 health points, dons a complete set of ebony armor, and fights using said sword. As a greenie fresh out of the sewer, your options for beating her are limited. Number 1, and probably the simplest option, is to lower your difficulty. This will make the one-on-one combat much more bearable and might even give you a fighting chance. Number 2 is to cheese the fight with ranged attacks. Setting yourself up in a position where her swings are out of reach, yet you can still hit her with magic and arrows works wonders. You'll be occupied for quite some time, but it might do the trick. Then there's option number 3, kiting her back to the Imperial City. This takes time, as the city is a ways away, and given her speed, she can probably catch up to you no problem. However, once you make it to the waterfront, you can then bring her into the Temple District and let the guards handle the rest. She'll take out a few on her way down, but that's free loot for you. The final bonus to Umbra's sword is its Soul Trap enchantment. It has 125 uses, and soul traps for up to 120 seconds. At level 1, you might not have that many enchanted items that need refilling. But as the game goes on, even at level 20 and beyond, this blade can offer a steady supply of filled soul gems. Now, flipping to Umbra's armor, it's safe to say that ebony armor at level 1 is an amazing head start. Retrieving the gear before level 15, the USP states that it shares the same stats with orcish armor. So, the boots can provide an armor rating of 5.5, the cuirass 13.75, the gauntlets 5.5, the greaves 8.25, the helmet 5.5, and the shield 16.5. To put that into perspective, that's a combined armor rating of 55 just at level 1. For a full set of iron armor at the best possible level, which is 30 plus, you're looking at a rating of only 40. It's safe to say that that number can be at least halved for the level 1 variation of the iron set. While this is certainly an incredible power up for the player, there's one big detail that needs to be addressed for Umbra's gear: repairing and maintaining it. Obviously, it depends on how damaged the set is, but a full repair on the armor alone might rack you up well over 1,000 septims. Fresh out of the sewers, that's no chump change. Then we look over at the Umbra blade, the star of the whole show. With very little wear to it, the repair costs almost as much as the entire set of armor combined. That doesn't even account for the cost to recharge its enchantment. However, at level 1, Soul Trap isn't that necessary to have, and for the rest of my experiment, I pretty much neglected it. Of course, money's no issue if you opt for the duplication glitch or Dorian glitch. It's completely up to you. For my playthrough, part of the fun and challenge is seeing and experiencing all of the pros and cons of the build. Now that the first part of the trial is over with, retrieving the sword and armor, it's time to actually put them to use. Let's see how effective they really are in combat. Now, I didn't have the money to repair any of my gear. Well, I did, but I was saving up for a full repair on the blade, so I let the armor fall by the wayside for just a bit. This is relevant because none of the items were in their best possible condition, so maximum damage wasn't being dealt, and the same goes for protection. Probably picking the least efficient quest for money, I decided to go lend a hand at the Kvatch Oblivion Gate. I wanted to do a very beginner-oriented quest and see what the crawl was going to be like. Pretty much all of the enemies I ended up facing were either stunted scamps or Jamora churls. Not really the best that the Daedra have to offer. For the former, I noticed a difference in terms of how few swings it actually took to kill them. I counted on average around 4 to 5 light attacks. Obviously, stamina plays a huge role in attack power, and this is where I really felt like I could see it in action. Less stamina meant upwards of 6 hits to defeat one, and a full bar could make it happen in 4. I know this isn't a great comparison, but having run through this section with an iron longsword before, the difference was very obvious. If not with the stunted scamps, then with the Jamora churls. Assuming stamina was above half, a single heavy attack could one-shot the baddies. Low stamina meant 2 heavy attacks, but was still incredibly effective. By my standards, I made it out of the Deadlands in record time, and I never really felt like I had to worry about my health. The armor held up nicely and provided me with adequate amounts of protection. Now, I will say the biggest con I noticed was my movement speed. Every character is going to be different, so take this part with a grain of salt, but at best I was running a 15-minute mile. I definitely spent more time jogging around the map than I did in combat, which is great. That means the sword was doing its job. But a fair warning to anyone who wants to use the armor, it's very heavy. It will take up a lot of inventory weight, almost 150 pounds worth, and it will slow you down. If you don't have anything to offset the movement speed, I hope you have a lot of patience, because you'll have plenty of time to take in the surrounding sights. I was worried that that factor would affect my ability to dodge and evade attacks. Fortunately, most destruction spells are slow enough for you to sidestep, and blocking with the shield pretty much absorbs most of the attack. Overall, my first experience with Umbra's gear went really well, and I could certainly see why people would go through all of the trouble at level 1 for it. To further test out the gear's effectiveness, I ran through the entire arena questline, from the first match as a brawler all the way up to the Grey Prince. This of course meant that I had to put most of the armor set to the side in order to wear the arena raiment. Keep in mind too that at this point, I still hadn't repaired the blade yet. I was chasing after its condition, as the more I used it, the more expensive the repair got. That was my second motive for enlisting in the arena. Quick and easy gold, which will hopefully pay for my gear maintenance. For the first few ranks, its condition was at around 50. Even so, Umbra did not disappoint. While paired with the shield, it created an almost unstoppable force. Absorb the hit, stagger the opponent, and launch off with some heavy attacks. Similar to the Oblivion Gate, it took me longer to run back to the Bloodworks than it did to finish off most of my opponents. Ironically, archers were the trickiest ones for me to take on. It wasn't that they were tough or difficult, it was just that they ran away a lot. My character had a tough time following closely, and all it really did was prolong the matches. Now, I've done challenges before where I roll through the arena at level 1 with some janky builds and still manage to come out on top. So what makes this one so different? Is going through the questline this early on really that effective at testing out Umbra's gear? Well, this run was essentially effortless. For those other playthroughs and challenge runs, I'd have to strategize, properly evade, and stock up on health potions. For this attempt, while only using the blade, shield, and helmet, I could have made dinner at the same time and still have been fine. In fact, other than for a select few matches, the iconic fights where I think everyone has a bit of trouble, there was no challenge whatsoever. At some point, while I was a Myrmidon, I made enough gold to finally have the blade repaired. Honestly, if you select Armorer as a major skill and just hard focus on bringing it up to Journeyman, you won't have any issues at all. Level 50 is all it takes to repair magical gear, and you'll save yourself so much money in the long run. Luckily for me, at this point in my adventure, I was making enough gold to where repairing the armor and sword were no longer issues. Now, as mentioned before, there were a few matches where I still had some problems. The first, and in my opinion, the one that's always been the hardest arena match, is the Argonian prisoner fight. It only took me 2 tries to beat, which is probably a new record for me at level 1. But they were still tough opponents. Not even the likes of Umbra could cut them down in a timely manner. However, once the hand-to-hand fighters were dead, the sword user was simple enough to block and counterattack. The next outlier match was the yellow team's 3 versus 2 battle. Not to blame my teammate, but Porkchop put on a below average performance. The fight went about as well as it normally would have gone. It was over in one attempt, but everything came down to the wire. Finally, there was the match against Agranak Gromalok. It was here that I was able to don my full ebony armor set again. At first, I set my expectations really high. I thought I was going to steamroll him in 5 to 6 hits. As soon as I was grounded and came back down to earth, I was still able to see just how effective Umbra was in the match. Following the fundamentals, the Grey Prince and I were going swing for swing. One of us would block while the other would go for a strike, and our health bars would fall accordingly. We were pretty much neck and neck up until the end. That's pretty huge for a level 1 taking on a level 10, without the use of any potions. Finally, I landed the killing blow and this experience was over. Again, it's really hard to see how overpowered your character is if you're not 1 or 2 shotting the average NPC. Every enemy is different, so it's tricky to see how scaled you are compared to them. It was during this next trial though where I really got that perspective. I decided to roam around Cyrodiil and lend a helping hand wherever I was needed, starting off with some of the Mages Guild recommendations. Finding Airthor in Bleakflat's cave has never been easier, specifically at level 1 without any fire attacks of course. The deranged zombie still took more than a few swings to take down, but in the past, even on normal playthroughs, they've always ended up being very time-consuming fights. Don't get me wrong, with low stamina, their health bars weren't dropping by much, but it was certainly improvement. The next thing I did was the Gale's recommendation over in Leywin, and that was a breeze. Open, blocking with a weapon, or blocking with a shield, it didn't matter. As long as I had a good amount of stamina, a single heavy attack and it was lights out. Both the Marauder Warlord and Kalthar fell into hits. By now, I pretty much got the full picture. Umbra was able to slash its way through practically every single enemy. Really, the only NPC it probably couldn't best was Umbra herself. Trolls fell with a single heavy attack or in 2 to 3 light ones. While retaking Kvatch, the stunted scamps were no issue, although the fully formed ones in the castle itself proved to be trickier opponents. Their fireballs and shoulder bashes did a number to my armor, and the amount of hits needed for the kill went up to double digits. Regular scamps have identical stats to the deranged zombies, so the data there does make sense. Moving on though, the Odil boys were safe and sound. Only a few of the goblins even got near them, and Umbra slashed its way through their ranks. Completing the circuit of Bloodcrust Cavern, the vampires had no clue what hit them. 2 to 3 dinky swings with Umbra, and they were banished to the Shadow Realm. I even went as far as tacking the Breville Town Guard. The guards are usually 10 levels above the player, so I really shouldn't have been able to cut them down in the streets like that. Through all of these combined experiences, I've come to my conclusions on Umbra's gear at level 1. However, before going over it, there was one final trial that I needed to go through. Artificially raising my character's level to 10 and seeing if the set could keep up. My Red Guard's level was adjusted accordingly, both strength and stamina were brought up to 80, block and heavy armor were elevated to 60, and blade was escalated to 70. I hope I didn't overinflate my blade skill. Assuming you only rely on swords, claymores, and daggers, I think it's very possible to reach a skill level of 70 by level 10. For every single weapon that I've done videos like this on, granted it's only been 2 and they've both been crummy weapons, the level 10 Cyrodiil portion always ends poorly. The weapons don't scale well at all, they hardly lower my opponent's health, and they just end up being more trouble than they're worth. With Umbra though, I wasn't surprised in the least to see that the streak had ended. Was I one-shotting with heavy attacks still? Not quite. Was I bringing down enemies with a couple of light swings? No, I wasn't. Was I still absorbing attacks with my shield? Not really. But was I still overpowered? Could I still take on an entire dungeon with only the armor on my back, my longsword in one hand, and my shield in the other? Yes, I sort of was, and yes, I could. In a level 10 Cyrodiil, the enemies start to get more diverse and powerful. The monsters and creatures begin to evolve into tougher opponents. Simple goblins turn into berserkers. Zombies flip into headless variations. Skeletons become guardians. Their overall stats increase and it becomes like any other fight. The same can be said for bandits, marauders, vampires, etc. While Umbra was still slashing away at their health no problem, its biggest issue started to come into play. There's no offensive enchantment on this blade. Soul Trap is good for filling soul gems, but that's about it. And at this point, depending on your mysticism skill or the enchanted items that you have, you might be able to soul trap in a more efficient way. At level 10, this sword is able to do 19 points of base damage. At level 1, it was dealing 13, and the enemies were a lot weaker then. They had nowhere near the same amounts of health. Now, I can get a hold of an elven longsword, throw a fire enchantment on it, and it'll deal more damage to most creatures than Umbra currently does. You can make 3 different weapons that cover the big 3 elements. You can diversify your enchantments and include more utility-based spells. That's the big thing with Umbra. It peaks early on. It's like the kid in 6th grade who hits their growth spurt and then never grows again. It's still a fantastic blade to have throughout the whole game, especially considering it can be a weight of 0, but once its base stats cap out, that's it. It's highly effective at level 1, but it fizzles out as time goes on. Here are my final impressions with Umbra the Blade, as well as the armor set. Starting off with the level 1 variation, actually acquiring the armor that early on is a nightmare. Without lowering the difficulty, beating Lenwyn in one-on-one combat is almost impossible. She has a pretty wicked health regen ability, and at low levels, that will offset almost any damage that you do to her. Legging it back to the Imperial City is easier if you have a speedy character, but if you stop for even a moment, she'll catch up to you and swing for the fences. With the addition of sprinting in the remake, successfully reaching the safety of the capital is a lot easier. Once Umbra is in the hands of the guards, your job is pretty much done, but it's getting her there that can be pretty tricky. After that, donning her weapon and armor will set you leagues ahead. You'll be able to slash through any enemy and take on a lot of damage. If you're someone who likes to feel OP in these types of games, this build is 100% for you. There's such a satisfying feeling that comes with naturally killing Umbra and reaping the rewards. However, if you're someone who enjoys the challenge of Oblivion and likes to scale with the world, I don't recommend this build at all. You will steamroll through everything. Enemies that you shouldn't be able to take on will be beatable, and dungeon crawling will be over in the blink of an eye. The game essentially goes to easy mode, and you might find yourself saying, what's the point? It completely revolves around how you want to enjoy Oblivion. Now, as you increase in level and the world gets tougher, Umbra begins to blend in with the crowd. The blade is still incredibly powerful, and the armor provides the same premium protection, but there are other weapons out there that now rival Umbra's strength. An enchanted dwarven claymore or even elven longsword pretty much match its output. The blade feels less enticing, and you might find yourself rotating through other gear pieces. Eventually, it may even become more of a utility piece. You might just use it to charge your other weapons, and that's completely fine. As mentioned before, to fully repair the sword, let alone the armor, it could be costly. Either you find a way to make good money quick, or depending on how you feel, you use exploits. Probably the best thing you can do for yourself is leveling up your armorer skill to 50. That way you can stock up on repair hammers for really cheap and just repair everything as needed. Finally, the last con that I've yet to talk about are the restrictions Umbra has on the game's story. If you choose to never do Clavicus Vile's Daedric quest and keep the blade at 0 weight, you won't be able to complete said quest, you won't be able to receive the Mask of Clavicus Vile, you won't clear that journal entry, and you won't be able to embark on Hermaeus Mora's Daedric quest. I know some people probably don't care about that. At this point, I'm not really a completionist myself, but others do care. Some people really like the idea of 100%ing the game or getting as close to that number as possible, and keeping the blade at 0 weight prevents you from doing that. Of course, the workaround is to simply complete the quest and accept the blade as a reward. You get to keep the sword, and you can progress with the Daedric quests. Umbra now has a weight of 45 though, and to some, that might not be justifiable for keeping in your inventory. Overall, I can certainly see why this build is considered among the most OP that Oblivion has to offer. At level 1, you're unstoppable. At level 10 and above, you're still a killing machine. You might make some switches and alterations here and there, but the set will always be there for you. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions on Umbra down below. Is this a build you've tried before, and how did you like it? Until next time, keep on adventuring. The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion has no shortage of interesting and unique weapons. A lot of these weapons have synergy amongst their enchantments that just make sense. Take for example Chillrend. It deals frost damage and inflicts weakness to frost on the target. Captain Cordan's Saber absorbs agility, endurance, and blade from the opponent. Distaran's Cleaver damages the enemy's strength and endurance. The Bow of Infliction drains the target's agility. These all make sense and flow really well together. Of course, you're also going to have weapons like Sinweaver. They have enchantments that don't correlate with one another, but at least they provide some kind of combat advantage, and if anything, prove to be more versatile than some of their counterparts. However, the same can't be said for all of Oblivion's weapons. There is one in the game that's always stumped me. I never knew what its purpose was and just assumed it was a weapon meant to troll and torture your opponents. I mean, it's literally in the name. The Elder Scrolls IV's Truncheon of Submission is an enchanted club that damages the target's fatigue by 50 points, yet regenerates their health by 20. It has 30 uses in one charge, and more times than not, you'll find yourself in an endless loop of beating down your opponent. Their suffering only ends when the enchantment runs out and you're forced to do damage to them, or if you switch to another weapon. In the past, I found myself scratching my head while using this thing. It always felt like something that the player wasn't meant to take seriously, a tool used to inflict pain and suffering on the guilty and the innocent. Well, for today's video, I've made it my goal to see how effective this thing actually is, and to see if it deserves a place in my weapons rotation. First, I'll be running through a series of quests and trials at a low level, Then I'll see how it fares against a level 10 Cyrodiil. Without further ado, let's begin. Here's my build for this playthrough. For character race, I picked Orc. I wanted somebody nice and strong who could throw in a little extra oomph when swinging the club. In the short term, it doesn't fully matter who's wielding the magical spanker, but an additional edge to the hits is always nice to have. Of course, I named her Mazaga, because if you know the lore, then you know the lore. Next, let's talk about star sign. This one was a rather simple choice in my mind. The warrior gives a decent starting buff to strength and endurance, something my green Punisher could easily benefit from. Then lastly, there's class. Realistically, there are only a select few options that I absolutely needed, and the rest were merely bonuses. For example, I chose a combat build over stealth and magic. As for attributes, I had to pick strength as my first one. For the second one though, I probably should have gone with endurance, but I ended up selecting intelligence. The reason behind this was so that way I could acquire Soul Trap early on and have the skill power and magicka to use it. Either way, not the biggest of deals. Then, for my major skills, I went with Mysticism, Block, and of course Blunt, as those were necessities for this playthrough. The remaining 4 weren't as important for a short-term build like this, so I just threw them in Restoration, Light Armor, Armorer, and Speechcraft. With Mazaga ready to go and punish the naughty folks of Cyrodiil, I set out for my adventure. The first stop I made was to lay eyes on the beautiful Truncheon of Submission. Traveling over to Anvil and heading inside of Morvaine's Peacemakers, I saw exactly how much work I had cut out for me. The Club of Trolling, in all its glory, was 5,423 gold. For a player fresh out of the tutorial, that's a pretty penny. Unlike the Goblin tutorial staff playthrough, I had to acquire the funds first before the actual challenge/review/usage part could happen. So, head down, I got to work. Returning to the Imperial sewers and heading into Vilverin, I swept through the dungeon, killing and looting anything in sight. This ordeal is certainly a lot easier without having to worry about my staff becoming useless in a matter of 10 casts. In any case, once my pockets were full, I went on over to the copious coin purse and sold my haul for a whopping 629 gold. Not a bad start, but to be honest, I was hoping for a little more. So this was where I decided to go ahead and utilize some in-game glitches for the extra cash. Even though the duplication glitch is able to accomplish the same thing as console commands, to me, a bug like this feels less like cheating and more like an exploit. Plus, as fun as it is to raid dungeons, that's not quite what this video is about. So, acquiring the necessary tools, I went to town on some Welkin stones. I'm sure Thornir had some thoughts about this method, but who's he to judge? Am I right, Thornir? In truth, I was going to do the duplication glitch for the soul gem portion of this run anyways. On the previous video, a lot of people were asking why I didn't go for Azura Star. It's a great suggestion, and honestly, I wasn't thinking about it at the time, but it also wouldn't have worked out that well either. If I only relied on one soul gem to recharge the Goblin Staff, a weapon that at times needed a refill to eliminate just one enemy, I would have run out of charge before the star could have even been filled. The petty soul gems were useful for banking multiple refills in my inventory for times like those. However, Azura Star would 100% work for the Truncheon of Submission. In fact, it's one of the quests I embarked on today. Either way, let me know down below if you think the duplication glitch is cheating, fair game, or if it really doesn't even matter to the content. Once the transactions were wrapped up with Thornir, I went on over back to Anvil and purchased the enchanted bottom beater. Before I could truly set off and rid the world of its corruption, I had to purchase the final components. A singular petty soul gem from the Mystic Emporium, and a soul trap spell from Alberic Litta. Now, Mazaga was ready to go and take on the world. Starting off light, I decided to go and fight off some rats, or rather, some mountain lions. Enlisting with the Fighters Guild, Azan sent me off to Arvena Thalos. I've never encountered a bug for this mission before, but of course, there's a first time for everything. She outright refused to speak with me, and she didn't want to move from the city bench. However, a small nudge did the trick. Heading on down into her basement, the first lone lion was harassing some of her rats. Using the club, I smacked the beast silly over and over again. As expected, its health didn't go down, but the thing was permanently paralyzed. It laid on the floor, unable to move, while the rats chewed away at its body. It was here that I learned the Truncheon of Submission's fatigue drain stacks, for lack of the better term. The more swings you put in, the longer the target is out of commission. I also learned that rats, or at least these ones, have common level souls, which didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, so that was technically the second roadblock for this quest. Something I didn't really discuss much of yet is the club losing its charge. Unlike the previous weapon review, the Truncheon actually becomes more deadly without its enchantments. You're now able to actually lower your opponent's health. However, the weapon's main attraction is its ability to drain copious amounts of fatigue. Without its powers, it's nothing more than a mundane club, and that's not what this video is about. However, with that being said, there's a strategy for how to efficiently wield it, and it's something that I'll be getting into very shortly. Now, at this point, I hit 2 more roadblocks. The first is that I wasn't able to duplicate filled soul gems. Sometimes the duplication glitch works when it wants to, and others it doesn't. It serves me right, I suppose. As for the other, and is one I 100% should have foreseen, petty souls barely recharge this thing. In fact, it only adds 1 extra use for the Truncheon's enchantments. In most cases, I would need 4 just to knock an enemy down. So, while Panaris went off to the Lion's Den, I was back at the drawing board. Detouring for a plan B, I returned to the market district and purchased an empty Grand Soul Gem from the Mystic Emporium. While this would certainly help, it wasn't going to solve my issue of not having big game to hunt. Without adequate soul sizes, I wouldn't really be getting much field research with this thing. So I decided to get a jump start with the action and steal the Arcane University's filled Grand Soul Gems. Then I went ahead and duplicated the empty one I had just bought in case there were some worthy foes in the upcoming battle. 1 recharge with a Grand Soul Gem brought me up to 14 uses, and while that was still surprising, it was good enough for me. Returning to Panaris and following him to the battlefield, together we charged in and took on the Lions. My testing strategy was to get around 4 hits in on one enemy and then move on to the next one. This way they'd be down for the count and Panaris could come finish the job. Guess what? It actually worked out pretty well. Now, I kind of sucked on my end and the latter half of the fight was all Inventius, but I was starting to get an idea on how to best use the Truncheon of Submission. Returning to Thalos' home and confronting the second lion in her basement, the same order of events took place. I beat the thing silly, the rats closed in and started taking it down. I watched on as the paralyzed beast was getting chewed away. Now, something that slipped my mind up until now is the target's health. Choosing to prolong its frozen state will almost completely negate any damage that's already been taken. So, because of my mistakes, I had to sit and wait another 40 seconds while the rat continued its work. Once the lion was dead, I harvested Thalos' final rat's soul, and that put an immediate end to the quest. I completely forgot that was a mechanic, but in any case, I learned a whole lot from this first mission. Moving on, the wheels started to turn for this playthrough. If I was lucky, the highest soul I could get at level 1 was common. However, there was one soul group that rivaled Grand Soul Gems for the highest output and could be obtained really early on. Heading to Fort Asteris, I approached the Necromancer's altar and placed a Grand Soul Gem inside. Waiting for the 4th of Heartfire, aka the Day of the Revenant Shade, I cast Soul Trap on the altar and thus a Black Soul Gem was born. Duplicating it via the glitch, it was from this point onward that I never had to worry about fuel for my club ever again. So long as humans, Mer, and beast folk were my targets, I was worry-free. Of course, that wasn't always achievable though, as you'll soon see. Anyways, back to the questing, I decided to do one more job with the Fighters Guild. Azan's next mission was the Unfortunate Shopkeeper, and this was the perfect time to try out my new tactic. Waiting for nightfall in Lel's quality merchandise, the 3 crooks broke in and it was officially clobbering time. Or so I thought. As it would turn out, at that given moment, I really didn't have much in the way of charging my club, nor did it have much of a charge to begin with. So a few swings and it was back to being a spiky baseball bat. Like mentioned before, I'm trying to find the best way to use this thing. Of course, that doesn't mean I have to pulverize my enemy until they're a shell on the ground, but I knew I was close to finding its true potential. Maybe it really is the most efficient when it's empty though, or maybe not, you'll have to keep watching. Eventually, I was able to bait 2 of the 3 men outside and capture one of their souls. The other NPC died before I could get to him, so that just left Storm the Burly, whom at this point was still inside the shop. Heading on back in for the 1v1, I was able to toy with him, beat him to the ground, watch him catch his breath, and then get back up for the repeat. It was actually pretty satisfying. Soon, I moved Storm outside and made a spectacle of him on the anvil docks. I guess, given our placement, nobody wanted to come over and finish the job, so I allowed him to get up and brought him closer to the guards. It was then that the town jumped in for the finisher and Norbert Lels could finally rest easy. However, this was the point in which I realized the Truncheon of Submission could really be effective in one of two ways, and this next quest was where I got to test my first theory. Now, I didn't really want to do any repeat quests from the last video, but this one was just too perfect not to. Last time, I attempted to fight off goblins at the Odil farm while simultaneously protecting the Odil boys from death. The tutorial goblin staff proved to not be very good for crowd control scenarios, as both Antis and Valis died. However, one of the ways I think the club can be incredibly effective is by not only paralyzing an entire field of enemies, like what we sort of saw with the rat problem, but by also allowing companions and followers to thrive. By literally knocking your targets unconscious, nearby allies can swoop in and finish the job, meaning that the player doesn't have to use any other weapon, and the enemies cause very little damage to surrounding NPCs as well as you. In theory, this sounds amazing, but how does it actually line up in practice? Well, my objective for the killing fields was to have both of the Odil boys survive, a far cry off from what happened last time. Readying myself with Valis and Antis, the first wave of goblins charged in, and I did my best to meet them head on. Getting a few hits on each creature, I didn't have much success with knocking them down, but I was able to pull aggro while the brothers slashed their way through. The second wave went a bit better. I was able to stop a few of them in their tracks, dropping them to the ground, and Antis finished them off. In fact, Valis really wasn't doing much at all, but it didn't really matter. As the third and final wave came in, I picked out the skirmisher of the bunch and made sure that it focused on me. Paralyzing it and having my companions slash away, the rest of the goblins were aggroed onto me and the brothers were danger free. While Antis was working away, I kept the 3 remaining goblins at bay, making sure they couldn't get up. While he shuffled over to my end, the creatures were completely incapacitated, making them easy kills. The Truncheon of Submission was actually able to keep the Odil boys alive. Its ability to control multiple enemies at once was astounding, and it seems like all 3 of us took very little damage. Overall, I was really impressed. Now, it was after this whole ordeal where I encountered another money-related issue. The Truncheon of Submission loses durability really quickly because it's built around being swung over and over again. My armorer level isn't high enough to repair it, so I needed to bring it into a professional. On average, when the club is below 20%, it costs me around 1,250 gold to repair. At level 1, that's like owing taxes to the government for the first time. It is expensive. Of course, my money issue is solved for this playthrough, so I suppose I'm committing tax fraud here. But it's not lost on me on how much work I would have needed to put in otherwise, both for expenses and for soul gems. Moving on to the next quest, I decided to take my services over to the Dark Brotherhood. Sacrificing Simplicity of the Slow, Mazaga was taken into custody and then released for good behavior. Finding a place to rest, Lucien LeChance popped in to say hello, and I was sent off to kill Rufio. Now, this is actually the quest I wanted to focus on for the Dark Brotherhood. I know it's rather lackluster and uneventful, but Rufio is such a feeble and weak NPC that he'll pretty much die with any form of contact. So I was curious if the Truncheon could be used to prolong his suffering. After all, he's a pretty horrible guy, so I definitely don't feel bad about trying. Unfortunately though, not even the 10 points of health regen could keep him standing, as one hit with the charged club was still enough to send him off into the void. Not really feeling satisfied with the end result, I decided to move into the next quest, a watery grave. This one took me over to the Imperial waterfront where I tackled Cyrodiil's fiercest buccaneers. The 3 crewmates outside of the Maria Elena were fairly spaced out. It was to the point where I could easily pull them into the nearest legionnaire and have him pick them off. Now, it wasn't necessarily a long-lasting issue, but I noticed that the Imperial soldier had a difficult time hitting his mark when the target was laying flat on the ground. And by missing his mark, I literally mean he couldn't land a single shot. I'm unsure if this is a skill issue or a programming issue, but the pirates were being served to him on a platter, and he kept missing with his fork. This was even the case with Gaston Tussaud, the target for this whole operation. After dragging him into the harbor, I knocked him out in the water. If only drowning like this was a thing, because there's no way he would have walked out of this scenario alive. Either way, I strung him along back to shore and practically stuck him on a wall for the watchman. What happened next, I have no clue how to explain. After missing each arrow over and over again, the Legionnaire just sort of disappeared. He vanished without a trace, practically deleted from the game. He wasn't in the water, he wasn't on the shore, he wasn't anywhere. With no one to finish the job for me, I drained the enchantment on the Truncheon and proceeded to beat the pirate captain to death. It worked like a charm though, and I was home free. Now, what happened next doesn't have anything to do with today's topic, but it was the first time I had ever seen this happen. It's apparently a common occurrence, which makes it even weirder for me, but I never knew that Ogash Gramaggle rides a horse through the waterfront. I had never seen someone on horseback here before, and it blew my mind. Just the other day, I was thinking to myself how no one rides horses through cities, and while this zone is technically outside, it's close enough to the capital for me. The things we continue to learn years after playing this game. Retiring Mazaga from the Dark Brotherhood, I decided to stick around the area and go for an unexpected voyage on the Bloated Float. This time, the ruffians were spaced out in different zones, so taking on each Blackwater brigand was a breeze. Sort of. You see, here I experimented with pickpocketing paralyzed opponents. Beating Lynch to a pulp, I was able to get into his inventory and grab the storage room key, freeing Graman Gromarad while the bandit was still breathing. It was a neat first experience for me, and while he was still down for the count, I ended his misery. For Minx, the next guard in my way, I did the exact same thing. This time though, I left her frozen on the floor and moved on to the top deck. Giving Wrath the same treatment, I grabbed Ormil's cabin key and went on back inside the ship. Popping in on Celine and Ormil, I had successfully made the rounds and reclaimed all parts of the Bloated Float, with there being only one casualty, and it's one that could have easily been avoided. While it's not the most glamorous ability, the Truncheon of Submission can be used to violently rob NPCs. Perhaps you need something that they have on their person, like a key, a note, a weapon, etc., and can't quite nail the stealth pickpocket. You don't want to kill them, yet don't mind running from the authorities or even paying a small fine in order to achieve your goal. It's a very specific feature, but a feature nonetheless. Of course, keeping every enemy alive and having nowhere to run has its downsides too, as very soon I was swamped by the brigands. There were definitely some close calls, and in the end, I even had to switch to another weapon because there wasn't any durability left on the Truncheon. This, however, was the birth of the second effective use for the club, or number 3 if you count the pickpocketing. It's probably the most efficient way to use the weapon, and it's something I'll be getting into very shortly. First though, we need to wrap up the low-level tasks and finalize effective use number 1. As I've said before, Mazaga was created in the image of her kin, Mazoga. Mazoga is a character who's involved in a couple of quests down in Leyawiin. The first one involves escorting her to Fisherman's Rock. The catch is though, as is with all companions, she'll follow you all around Cyrodiil. So, you can use this battle-hardened orc to your advantage and have her slay your opponents while you immobilize them. Now, the Truncheon doesn't have any special abilities that specifically help against vampires. However, in order to get some enemy diversity and to obtain Azura's Star, I ventured off to Azura's Shrine and began her Daedric quest. With Mazoga by my side, we entered Gutted Mine and initiated the cleanse. All in all, the process worked pretty well. Mazaga would beat our opponent into submission, leaving them stunned on the ground, while Mazoga would hack away and slash at their health. A select few of the afflicted brethren were a little tougher than others, and in those moments, I did what I could to help my sister along. Honestly, I would say at this point, the only thing that could have improved this tactic was if my follower was essential. For example, either Martin or Maglir would have been perfect, as they would only get knocked unconscious if their health went down to 0. In any case, once the mines were cleared of all undead, I returned to Azura and received her star, the relic that's supposed to solve all of my soul gem problems.
What kind of deal can I make for you today? What can I interest you in? That's more than I'd usually pay. Another satisfied customer.
Only kidding, of course, I would never actually sell the artifact. Although I will say it never really ended up getting used. I had way too many black and grand soul gems that took precedence, but it was nice to know that it was there. Since she helped me out with my quest, I decided to make good on my promise to Mazoga and take her to Fisherman's Rock. Honestly, no complaints from me on the fight with Mogans and his crew. There were 4 of them to defeat, and while Mazoga was busy with the Dark Elf, I incapacitated the other 3. I cycled through each one, giving them a couple of smacks here and there in order to keep the enchantments going. Unfortunately, Mazoga was having some trouble completing the kills, and that was likely because I kept healing them with the Truncheon, so I stepped up and helped her out. After that was said and done, we went our separate ways, and I was on to my last task at level 3. This was the beginning of the second effective use for the Truncheon of Submission. Now, I've been really hyping it up, but in all honesty, it's probably the most obvious thing someone can think of, and you've likely been repeating it to yourself throughout the video. Arguably, the most efficient way to use the club is by starting out the battle with it, immobilizing your opponent, and then finishing them off with a whole other weapon. Or, if you've timed it perfectly, using what's left of the Truncheon's charge, and then killing the opponent with a dried up club. I've been able to periodically accomplish this, but it hasn't been my main focus yet. So in order to formally test it out, I spoke with Maeva at Whitman Farm, initiated When the Vow Breaks, and set off for Fort Strand. Here, I encountered marauders, and for the most part, the technique worked like a charm. They'd freeze in 4 or so hits, I'd keep slugging away for the additional downtime, and then when ready, I'd switch over to the Iron Battle Axe and chop away. Just before their death, I'd cast Soul Trap, and the process could then be repeated. Now, you're probably thinking, isn't that more work? You could have just fought with the Battle Axe all along and accomplished the same thing. 100% yes, that is correct. A regular weapon expedites the process, and you can move through the dungeon a whole lot quicker. You don't have to worry about soul trapping your enemies in order to fuel your first strike. Where the advantage lies though is with group fights. It can be used to incapacitate your enemies, allowing you to focus your efforts on one while taking less overall damage from the others. That leads me into my next point. If done correctly, you could be taking way less damage during bigger fights. By getting 4 good hits in at the start of the match, you won't have to worry about your opponents fighting back. For an entire dungeon with petty enemies, this can be very time consuming. But for a boss fight like Azani Blackheart or Bealfie the Contemptible, this can be life-saving for your character. Feeling like I've already gotten a lot out of this experience, the last thing I wanted to try was wielding the Truncheon of Submission in a level 10 Cyrodiil. Artificially inflating my overall level, I didn't adjust my major skills or attributes accordingly. Not to mention, the rest of my gear, like armor and consumables, were outmatched. I thought for sure that this was going to nerf my playthrough. I'd barely stand a chance against most enemies, especially since I'd be healing them. Well, the result here actually surprised me, and then it didn't. Let me explain. The first quest I did was Raid on Greyland. This involves only fighting 2 skooma traffickers. They're armed to the teeth, but it's certainly no dungeon crawl. Stepping on inside of the manor, I managed to only aggro one of them and pull them outside. Tanking a few hits, having my health drop by more than a sliver, the marauder soon went down to the ground where I could then hack away with my axe. His HP took a bit of time to go down, but given my blunt level and the actual weapon I was using, it worked wonders. Taking my efforts back inside and targeting the Dark Elf, I repeated the process, and it also worked really well. He wasn't getting up anytime soon, and I was able to chip away at his health until he was a goner. Honestly, it was a really positive experience, and it gave me even more hope for this build. That is, until I encountered the club's bane. Battling against the undead has been on my to-do list. Not necessarily vampires, skeletons, or zombies, but wraiths, liches, and ghosts. Wanting a different angle from the previous video, I initiated the Forlorn Watchman and hopped into the MMA. Given my level, the lesser crewmates were reanimated in the form of ancient ghosts. I should have known, or at least assumed, but fatigue isn't really something that spirits have to worry about, at least not in the same sense as the living. I could bash them all I wanted to, but at the end of the day, I was really only healing them while the club was charged and throwing pennies at them while it was dry. The ghosts, on the other hand, kept pressing the fight, tearing me a new one. I knew eventually I'd run into a hard block like this, and there are probably many others out there as well. Before long, I knew it was pretty much hopeless, and I abandoned the effort. Spirits, specters, and ghosts are a no-go for the Truncheon of Submission. To wrap up my whole experience and to cleanse my palate, I crawled through a bandit dungeon and enlisted in the arena. For the arena section, I was curious to see if I could make it past the pit dog stage. To my delight, I could. Each fight would begin and I'd come out swinging. 4 hits with the truncheon and they were on the ground. Unloading the rest of my charge, they were paralyzed for good. From there, I would equip the iron battle axe, slash away at their motionless bodies, and cast Soul Trap on them at the last second. With Azura's Star, this is a process that could be repeated for quite some time and could allow you to advance to far stages for this faction. Of course, the 3-on-1s would be tricky, not impossible, potentially easier than they would have been without it, but the hard stop would be against the Grey Aegis, the shield that has 100% resistance to magic. As for the dungeon crawl, it was methodical, smooth, and quite enjoyable. Again, for fighting regular old enemies like bandits, the truncheon is overkill and will really only consume your time. But there are key moments like facing off against ringleaders, warlords, matrons, patrons, adepts, etc. that it will come in handy. Here are my closing remarks for the Truncheon of Submission. First and foremost, I really do think it's a weapon that was meant for role-playing / trolling your enemies, beating them senseless, incapacitating them, and then providing a full heal to prolong the ordeal. Feels like Bethesda knew they were making a counterintuitive weapon. However, buried beneath its comical purpose, there are actually a couple of ways to effectively use it, making it a highly efficient tool. First of all, you can forcefully pickpocket your target. This is useful if your pickpocket abilities aren't proving successful, yet you don't want to kill the NPC either. It feels like using a knife as a screwdriver. It's not its intended use, but it'll still twist the flathead. Secondly, you can use the club to give your followers and companions an easy time during combat. You can knock down your target while they close in for the kill. If you were far outmatched in a dungeon or didn't have any more supplies to heal yourself, this could be a viable technique. Ultimately though, by letting your follower take on most of the heat, you'd be losing out on a lot of valuable experience for your skills. This is what leads into the most effective use for the Truncheon of Submission. Using it at the start of combat, paralyzing your opponent, and hacking away at their defenseless body. If you try to use it halfway through the fight, you're going to end up negating any damage that you've already done to them. So, using it at the beginning when their health is already full won't reverse any work that you've put in. Sure, you might take some damage getting those 4 or so hits off, but afterwards you'll be home free. I think the Truncheon of Submission is best used during a 1v1 with a boss level enemy. Arena combatants, the Grey Prince, Mana Marco, Matthew Bellamont, Zani Blackheart, Mankar Cameron, you name it. That one hostile NPC who's leagues above the rest, that's when I think this club actually proves to be incredibly useful. It gives you that extra edge in battle that tips the scales in your favor. Would I personally include it in my weapons rotation for the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion? Honestly, probably not. The price point and maintenance on this thing is just too much. Over 5,000 gold for the purchase, over 1,200 for the full repair, and a constant supply of hefty soul gems just to keep it charged. All so I can have a free win in a battle. It's not for me, but I can understand those who would want it on their character. I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions on the Truncheon of Submission down below, and until next time, keep on adventuring.